So next session is the panel discussion, but before that we have Jenty Kirsch-Wood, who is from the UN Disaster and Risk Reduction Agency, and she's head of Global Risk Analysis. Now, Jenty has a long career in many, many countries, which I'm not going to list, but much of the focus has been on climate change and disaster management. And Jenty's going to discuss with us UNDRR's work on systemic and cascading global catastrophic risks, which is an area I think that we at CSER are particularly interested in, so I'm going to be paying a great deal of attention. Jenty, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. So I have to admit, it's a bit of an intimidating audience. I am not a PhD. I have not wrestled a cobra. And the only thing that you will find in terms of black and white answers today is probably in my outfit. It's a very messy area that we work in. And it's particularly messy because I see that actually on the screen is the zero draft of the presentation that I was going to make today. It's not so different, but there'll even be a couple of typos and things like that, because it seems like it may have been a bit of a mix-up on the version that made it onto the screen. No big thing. And I'm just checking if there is a time display here. Otherwise, I would beg somebody, there we go, to be able to cut me off and wave as needed. So I'm from the United Nations UNDRR, Disaster Risk Reduction Organization. And I would say that I'm very much a practitioner in the sense that we've been practicing for a long time on how to better reduce risk. But it's very clear that to some degree, under no circumstance should we be calling ourselves experts. Because the first slide that I wanted to put here is very clear that we've clearly not been doing it right. Risk is increasing, and our global systems are not sustainable. Now, what that chart shows you is basically the correlation, it's not causation, but it is a correlation, between a reduction of poverty and an increase in consumption. And this is a really big fundamental problem, and it goes back to how are we going to begin to transform our systems if basically our Sustainable Development Goals look at trying to increase prosperity, but in doing that, we're not able to stay within our ecosystem limits. And that's a huge fundamental problem for how we approach work moving forward. And similarly, we've got another core challenge here, which is that disaster and economic losses are increasing. It's very, very clear. Look at that chart up on the top. This shows that we've not been doing enough. Frankly, our team, our organization, our global efforts are not managing to address disasters or economic losses anywhere near to the extent that we should be. And of course, that trend, if you like, was already kicked off with a relatively high curve before we threw on the additional issue of climate change, which by its nature is increasing the intensity and the volatility of exactly the events that were driving disasters. So we've got to recognize that not only were we not necessarily doing enough before we really began to recognize the climate change threat, but we've really got to redouble our efforts and do things differently. Doing more of the same is probably not going to be an effective challenge based on this, particularly as we see some of the things like biodiversity, which have been a buffer for global sustainability, decreasing. And I think in this audience, many of you would have seen this before. This is from the Stockholm Resilience Center, but it shows, we're breaching a whole series of ecosystem limits. So when we're talking today about global catastrophic risk, I mean, look here on ocean acidification. I don't think anyone's even mentioned that phrase, at least in the sessions I've been in for the last 3 days. And yet we're pretty clear to that ecosystem limit. And for the experts that I've talked to about issues like ocean acidification, we should be pretty concerned about it. So there's a challenge here in recognizing that we need to do things in a different way. And we need to also recognize that risk is essentially contagious. Now, this is a chart that comes from the last GAR report, Global Assessment Report, and it basically looked at multiple breadbasket failure. But if you look at any of the items on that list, actually, they could have been a catalyst. If it's drought, heat wave, displacement, water conflict. When we were playing with the scenario exercises, those who were in the room yesterday, Any of those could have been that trigger for that global catastrophic risk. And so what I want us to think about today is the fact that we need to look, yes, at the sectoral specialities. Of course, we need those sectoral specialists. But the bit that I'm most interested in and struggling with and look forward to learning from you all about is the relationships between those sectors. Because if we don't get that right, there is no way that we will be able to, if you like, stop the escalation and the cascading kinds of risks that can take a small virus in Wuhan and turn it into the next pandemic. And I think when we talk about that bit of systemic risk, again, I need to be extraordinarily humble because it's not really clear even what we mean by systemic risk. And I worked with some really great people from the ISC and the RiskCan network last year, and we played around with looking at different concepts of systemic risk, looking at how we can begin to understand systemic risk, because it's a phrase very, very widely used. And this is as close as we got. It's basically a bit of a literature review of various different things around systemic risk. And we could see, yes, we see that there are particular characteristics around relationships, around understanding systems, around scales, around transboundary impacts that we can identify as being the kinds of things that trigger or amplify risk generation. But as you can also see, it's extraordinarily messy. And when we look at the outcomes, we also see that for systemic risk to really take force, it has to be able to look at things like tipping points, breakdown, and system collapse. But that very nature means, how do you prepare for events that are, by their very nature, unknown, unknowable, unpredictable, and underestimated, which is more or less what I pulled from the slide before. And I think that this is something that as we move forward and we look at how to manage global catastrophic risk, it's really important that we stop looking for the magic bullet, the perfect contingency plan. I can remember many, many years ago, I worked in Somalia. And we decided we were going to try and do a really good strategic plan and a really good humanitarian plan for Somalia. And we got a whole bunch of fantastic people in the room, very representative. And we ended up, I think we stopped when we hit something about 60 or 70 different contingency planning variants. And our document had already hit 400 pages. And it became utterly obvious to us that it was going to be impossible to operationalize this thing. You couldn't send a 600-page document to the Red Cross and say, use this next food insecurity season. And so what I'm trying to hit on here is that we need a different type of approach to managing global catastrophic and systemic risks that actually has at its core, we're not going to be able to know, we're not going to be able to properly predict. And we're going to have to recognize that we always underestimate things. So we need to get better at skills like agility, pivoting, learning, listening, and adjusting, rather than assuming we have a form of scientific hardcore knowledge. Now, of course, I was then given the nice task by the organizers of this event of saying, okay, you can lay out the problem and then tell them how you're solving it. And I have to admit, as I said at the beginning, I think there's a lot of ways to go, but there is something that's called the SENDAI Framework, and I do actually genuinely believe, and this is not only because they pay my salary, that those 4 priority areas are quite a good set of pillars, if you like, for what needs to happen if you're going to be able to address a more complex, systemic, and potentially catastrophic global challenge. You've got to be able to try and understand the risk. I don't believe you will achieve that, but you've got to do your best to try and understand it. You've got to try and strengthen the risk governance arrangements for managing it. If you don't build that into the system, you can have a beautiful report that has nowhere to go or just never gets it across that transboundary element that is critical and essential to understanding these sorts of global challenges. You've got to make sure that there is an investment mechanism that attempts to build resilience before the event happens. This is about prevention, it's about risk reduction, and it's also about making sure that there are financing mechanisms. I mean, you only have to look at the issues around global vaccines in the last few months to recognize that if you don't have that as part of the planning at the beginning, you can go back to square one at the time when you are most needing to be responding. And the final bit is that you need to be building back better, or you need to be learning. So you need to be looking at events as they happen, you need to be looking at issues that come up, and you need to be adjusting what you do. I think that Paul said it very beautifully when he said, you know, it's not about convincing other people to think like you, it's about listening to why they don't think like you, and then adjusting what you might be doing to learn from that so that next time you can do it better. And so just to give a quick sense of some of the things that are sort of on the menu right now, in terms of approaching for an understanding of disaster risk, I think it's essential to engage experts across silos. And I mean, this is part of the reason why I'm here. It's always good for me to come and speak to people who do things totally different to what I do and think about, wait a minute, have we been considering that at all and how we're approaching things? It's important to do things like try to model systemic risks, but again, not as a predictor, but as a catalyst for out-of-the-box thinking. I try and say quite often that we try and work with countries to exercise their systemic risk analysis muscles. Yeah, we don't pretend when we discuss with governments that we're going to come and we're going to be able to chart out for them the systemic risks and how actually they can face their climate challenge. But we do hope to encourage them to think and connect differently, to think about different aspects of the challenges they may face so that they can be more responsive. This also means building in things like redundancy and flexibility into systems. Now that sounds very basic, but you try and go to a government official and say, you need to fund redundancy. It's incredibly difficult because we have an efficiency focus that is how we have organized our concept of progress for the last 500 years. And the point of saying, look, you've got to be able to have some wiggle room, it's a very different concept in terms of thinking about how you manage risk. And of course, you have to learn. And so just some examples of some of the things that we're working on. We're working with people like Michael Obersteiner and Francesca Gaup, looking at different ways that you can both learn from things like the modeling of the financial crisis in 2008. You can use some of the network analysis from those systems models, and can you then apply that to, for example, modeling impacts on social development indicators, on building and climate change. Incredibly smart people, incredibly interesting work. But what they've also been telling us is, we think, you know, of course, they believe their models are as good as they can, but they say what they're really interested in is finding different consultative ways of having those models discussed, ground truth, triangulated with really different kinds of stakeholder groups, including very, very much cross-sections of affected populations. And there's some, so I think that's really a part of how we need to look at different diverse approaches to looking at risk questions that bring people into the room, but with also better information. The second part is trying to get a better common risk language. I mean, this is things like the hazard definitions. I'll come to a little bit about how the UN is beginning to define its risk areas and how we're trying to implement some of those planning processes. And of course, you know, there's always a good need to try to understand more, you know, previous disasters, where we can learn. I do think that with all of this work, when I was preparing for this, I was like, but you know what, we're really not very good at doing the large scale, you know, the low frequency, high impact type events. I would say that really is a gap in a system. At the same time, I do think that there's some interesting work that is helpful in building resilience that might not be unuseful to those processes. Just to make a quick plug a little bit to some of those issues around the common risk language, I would encourage people to look at those hazard definitions and classifications. And the point here is not, again, that they're put forward as a piece of truth. The idea actually is that we'll update them probably every couple of years. And this was developed with an incredible multi-stakeholder group of, I think, several thousand different academics and practitioners and scientists all contributed. But what it's trying to do is give people a more holistic approach about some of the things, if you're trying to look at, for example, how climate change might affect your particular system. Have you thought about, well, what does that do to hazards? And that we don't mean just, you know, that's hydrological, geological, environmental, biological. Similarly, social, economic, and environmental vulnerability. Do we look at different, you know, past and future trends? Do we look at disasters? Trying to just get people to think a little bit more holistically. And one of the ways that we've been applying this is in some work that we're doing right now in terms of data aggregation. And we're working, I think, now in about 15 hopefully up to 30 countries in the next year. And essentially, we're doing data aggregation of the best available risk information organized against those hazard profiles. We're not producing the information ourselves. We wouldn't dream of doing that, but we're trying to at least curate it a little bit better. And then we go into the process of the common country assessment, which is how the UN system as a whole writes its work plan with the government over 5 years. And we're just honing in on the risk assessment section of that, which has always been done, but has been a bit of a haphazard process. And we're just trying to help them improve their accessibility and use of risk information organized by the categories you've seen, in those planning processes. And this is how the Common Country Assessment Risk Framework works. Now, there are some of those that UNDRR in our mandate we don't cover so well, like democratic space, political stability. We leave those to some of the other parts of the UN system. But for the roughly around 10 or 11 of those, we've got some relatively good aggregation data that we can apply to those sorts of processes. So that's a little bit on how we're trying to help improve risk understanding. In terms of the risk governance, this is really trying to encourage more multilateral coordination and action. And this is, getting organizations, again, even in that last process we talked about with the UN country team, it's really pushing even within the UN system, people to break down the silos between the food people in WFP, who will of course see the main systemic risk as the food side, compared to the UNICEF people, compared to the disarmament people, and just trying to say, look guys, look at the spaces between you, and look at where you may be contributing to aggregation of risk, or you may have opportunities to reduce risk, rather than while maintaining your integrity and your expertise, how do you get that discussion going more? And I think it's already been noted before that in terms of some of the examples also that go far beyond my organization, I take no credit for this, there are now things like the UNSG discussion around a global risk report, which we're engaging on a little bit, as well as the idea of a common emergency platform. Some of this is really trying to learn lessons from the pandemic. That's very much where that motivation came from. It's very much where the impetus for more multilateral collaboration came. We have to hope in the current environment, which is not necessarily good for multilateral action, that it can be sustained. But I think there are some real opportunities to try to get that cross-sectoral thinking and to engage in different understandings of governance mechanisms. In terms of investing in risk reduction, I think there's also some things that can be done where investing in resilience and adaptive risk governance, it does increase capacity. And even if you do that in terms of pandemic preparedness, or you do it in terms of infrastructure strength, you do it in terms of earthquake preparedness, if you begin to do it with that sense of humility, learning, and flexibility and agility, I firmly believe that this will help you be in a better position to face the risk that you never saw coming. And so I very much believe that you need to make sure that you put an investment in risk reduction, you put an investment in understanding vulnerability, and you try to see how networks can be made more resilient. But a key part of that is, I think this is a very common phrase you would well understand, what gets measured gets valued. And I think one of the key challenges we have right now is that we are far too focused on measuring by indices such as GDP, economic growth, that's very much as rather than on people and prosperity. And so I also very much hope as we move forward, when we're looking at what are the cost benefits, instead of thinking cost benefit in economic terms, we move more to a multivariable recognition that when you are looking at the value of an action, you need to see what are the impacts going to be on people, what are the impacts going to be on environment, on the planet, and then whether or not it has a higher or a lower economic cost. So some of the examples around this are obviously new efforts around pandemic contingency planning, and actually quite a lot of work on metrics. And particularly, I think one of the great opportunities here, and I would really encourage people in this room to think about this, is the global goal for adaptation. Has anyone noticed here that we can all talk in climate change terms about greenhouse gas reductions? There is no metric that is currently understood at all for measuring resilience and adaptation, and that is a massive impediment to preventing global catastrophic risk, the biggest global catastrophic risk that we face in our future. I mean, I would only remind you that if you think that it's expensive to turn your heating, turn your heating up in the current context, imagine how expensive it will be to move Cambridge if sea level rise continues on its current trajectory. I'm glad to say I don't need to present this slide because Clarissa did it beautifully. I'd really like to encourage you all to join this effort. This is a piece of work that UNDRR worked on with the Science Council and IRDR last year. It was already plugged in the last session. But essentially, I think there's a lot of those research priorities around that global risk landscape that hit on some of the points that I've raised here. And so I'd really encourage you as researchers to take a look at those 9 priority areas. I think they hit on some quite interesting questions around inequality, around cognitive understanding of risk, around understanding metrics. And if your research fits into any of these, connect to the various networks, connect to the global networks, connect to the STAGs, the UNDRR science and technology groups. Try and find other people who might be working in those same areas. And if your research doesn't fit into these, I'd love to know why. And because then maybe we're doing something wrong, or maybe it's a question about, okay, what is going on here? Because I think it's really important that we try to look at various aspects of risk reduction. So I've just got 2 more slides. And the first one that I wanted to just put forward as food for thought is we live in a time of certain uncertainty. We are going to need to adjust what we do. We face a volatile and uncertain future. That is the only thing that we can be certain about. And that means that we will not be able to control this process. We will need to adjust, we will need to pivot, we will need to be able to be agile as different risks emerge. And the first line of defense, however, I believe is also clear, and we do not need more information to push this forward. It is that if you reduce vulnerability, you reduce inequality, and you reduce exposure, you increase resilience. There is no need for more studies on this. It is absolutely clear. Countries that have lower levels of vulnerability, whether it's economic, social, gender disparity, they will be more resilient in the face of shocks. And those shocks can come from any direction. They can be health, solar flares, disasters. That ability to have resilience doesn't necessarily change. So that's a no-brainer action, if you like. Investing in understanding disasters can help support effective decision-making. If you don't actually understand what happened, how are you expecting to provide policy advice to do it better next time? But also understanding systemic risk requires systemic solutions. You can't say the solution to the pandemic, the next pandemic, is health. It's simply not only health. There are people who are publishing papers now saying that more people died from the economic impacts of COVID than from the health impacts. I don't verify that. I have absolutely no clue. But the very fact that that could be said is a fascinating statement. It's also clear that investments in risk analytics are essential, but I get very, very worried when I go to governments and they say, we're building this model that's going to tell us this. We're waiting, we want you to produce an index that will rank us against that, because it's very clear, this is very messy, this is not black and white. You are going to need to use that modeling data, the best modeling data you can get, to have discussions with actual real people and then learn from that and apply what may come out. And you also need to rework your financial systems to actually value sustainable development. Because I would say, for example, right now, the whole global economic system has a huge amount of built up, uncalculated risk that is simply not accounted for. Your pension fund, can you go to your pension fund and can they tell you that they've taken into account what the climate future will be when you claim your pension, for some of you in 50 years? Can they show you an assessment that says that they have taken into account what the adaptation future will be like? They cannot. And that's even your pension fund, let alone other aspects of your society. And so here are some questions that I sometimes give to governments just to ponder. But I think they're not a bad little checklist to finish with today, which is, how agile are your planning systems to uncertainty? And how quickly can your systems pivot? Do you have information on what drives vulnerability and exposure? Who's often left out of that data? And what safety nets are in place for those people who often do get left out? Do your planning and budgets include provisions for investing in resilience building and in protecting essential infrastructure? And if not, how can that happen? Have you begun to look at the knock-on and cascading effects of disasters? And I define disasters pretty broadly here. And if you've begun, do you have modeling that can do that? And if not, can you start? And who needs to be part of the process to interpret and use that analysis? And do your fiscal planning systems model people, planet, and prosperity? Or do they tend to just focus on one aspect of that? And how could this become more balanced in your context? And do you value your children's generation when you're doing your planning? Do you have a plan for what your children's future will look like in terms of what world we're leaving them? So I know I've sort of not slightly dodged the question, but I hope this gives a feeling for some of the work that is going. And I would definitely say that, I started off, God, I dread to think how many years ago, more than 20, doing humanitarian work for Oxfam and IRC in conflict zones, in disaster settings around the world. And at that point, when we tried to go, I remember at one point working in a refugee camp in Kenya that was predominantly for Somali and Kenyan refugees, Somali and Sudanese refugees. And we discovered actually that there was a malnutrition problem. But the malnutrition problem was not amongst the refugees, it was amongst the local Turkana people who were being badly affected by a drought. And when I first went and I said, all right, we need to have feeding programs for the local population, I was told we couldn't because we were only there to deal with the refugee problem. We weren't there to deal with the problem of starvation amongst the under fives in the area. We did work that problem out, but it was a beautiful example of how silos weren't working. And what I would say is that there is a sea change now in terms of opportunity. Because when I first raised that question 20 years ago, or actually I didn't raise it, when my incredible health team came and said, we're going to resign unless something happens about this because this is horrific, it can't go on, we had to push those questions. Now governments are asking, you can see the UN General Assembly is asking, give us a global risk report, tell us how to better manage adaptation. So the timing for all of you is perfect, but it's really important that we do things differently because more of the same is not going to work. And I very, very much hope that this center and some of the work that you're all engaged in can be part of that solution and moving things in a different direction. Thank you very much. And there's my contacts for anyone who may need.
Jenty, thank you. I was sitting here wondering what that sensation was going up and down my spine, and I realized it's the resonance I feel when you speak. So thank you very much. We're going to go on to the panel, so if those that are speaking can come up. Oh, no, we're doing questions after the panel. So. So kicking off the panel, we have James Gins, who is Head of Risk Management at the Centre for Long-Term Resilience. I was going to speak about the Centre for Long-Term Resilience, but I think it's all in the name. The CLTR is a very close partner with CSER. James, over to you.
Thank you very much. Do you want me at the podium or here?
Here's fine.
Here's fine, great, thank you. Well, good morning, everybody, and it's great to be here. I've just joined the Centre for Long-Term Resilience, having spent a career so far in the private sector. New to CSER, it's my first visit as well, but it's great to be with you. I'll start with a quick story and a few points and questions which I'll pose, which hopefully will add fuel to the panel discussion. And it's great, I think, it's exciting to be able to pick up on Jenty's encouragement to invest in resilience and preparedness. And in agile governance systems. So that fits very well with some of what I've been thinking about too. The story first. On an unusually cold January Florida morning in 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger tragically broke apart 73 seconds into its flight, killing all 7 crew members on board. Included in that crew was the school teacher, Krista McAuliffe. Her family had been told there was a 1 in 100,000 chance of a fatal shuttle accident. To cut a long story short, the main indirect cause of the disaster was found to be a lack of checks and balances in NASA's management. The likelihood of a fatal accident was actually 1 in 100, and even less in cold weather. That was known to parts of NASA and had been known for a long time prior to the incident. I cite this story as it illustrates the pitfalls, I think, very well, that robust risk management governance and process is designed to avoid, and that I would argue the private sector, if not NASA, has learnt to adopt through various crises over the past 35, 40 years, especially in financial services. I would further argue that these should be applicable to the way government, domestically and internationally, manages risk, and in particular extreme and catastrophic risk. Let's look at governance and process very quickly in turn. In governance terms, the private sector has learnt the hard way about the issues of marking one's own homework, lack of independence, lack of clear accountability. All these allow risk to incubate, mitigations to be avoided, and facilitates desperate men and women doing desperate things. In terms of process, the danger is a static risk register, a sort of tick box exercise done in silos over an insufficient time horizon as well. That leads to a lack of proper risk identification, a lack of a systemic approach, and it's no surprise, therefore, it can't deal with systemic risk. And I was very interested to hear Jenty talk about systemic risk earlier. And no effective mitigating actions either. So what's the answer to this? I think my main point today is that the private sector experience shows, I think, that resilience can be readily boosted by adopting the governance of an overarching risk management framework, and in particular what we call 3 lines of defence. And that normally includes the role of a chief risk officer on the 2nd line of defence. And secondly, by a dynamic risk profiling process, which is much more agile and normally features workshops. I heard Clarissa talk a lot about workshops earlier. That was encouraging. They have a great role to play, I think, including horizon scanning for emerging risks, all importantly, vulnerability assessment. There's a lot of emphasis on likelihood, but not enough emphasis on vulnerability, and realistic scenario planning as well as part of that. So at CLTR, we would advocate getting this methodology hopefully right in the UK first. I think there's a great opportunity off the back of COVID-19 and all the reviews of how that was handled. There's a real opportunity to make progress in the UK, and then potentially the UK taking a leadership role on resilience internationally, offering a blueprint potentially for the 3 lines of defence in and across government, annual meetings potentially again of chief risk officers from different countries, talking about perhaps COVID-19 learnings, a light set of structures and processes for UN member states perhaps to address extreme risks as a stepping stone perhaps even to a formal extreme risk treaty, and the Common Agenda initiative at the UN, very encouraging cooperation in managing shared risks and in preparedness. Could we add private sector learnings to that and processes, and could those be taken up as part of that discussion? So I'll just conclude with two quick questions. What is the catastrophic risk equivalent of an unusually cold Florida morning? And will we collectively and globally be prepared to meet that challenge through the way we manage extreme risk, such that its impacts are at least mitigated and if not avoided altogether? Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to Max Stauffer, who is the CEO of the Simon Institute for Long-Term Governance in Geneva. He's also in Geneva Science Policy Interface and the Global Studies Institute. But most importantly, he's a great dancer, as I discovered last night. He's going to speak on engaging with global institutions. Max.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. So what I'm going to talk about is kind of like a pragmatic lens on going from kind of like complex ideas on global catastrophic risks and knowledge we have on like solutions we can implement to actually policy change at the global level or the multilateral level, and how we can actually go from one side to the other. In my opinion, and based on experience, going from one side to the other requires to understand a little bit the complex reality of policy making and how policy actors, whether they're diplomats or civil servants, actually behave in the world and listen to us or do not listen to us. And I think there's one important fact is that these policy actors tend to rely on shortcuts. They rely on shortcuts in how they shift their attention to problems. They rely on shortcuts in how they search for information, in how they filter information, and how they make decisions. And they rely on shortcuts because of the many constraints that characterize their decision environment. They have time constraints. They don't have a lot of time to consider so many issues. They're subject to information overload because they're bombarded with so many reports, speeches, papers, and they face uncertainty and complexity, but with the requirement to actually act. So they cannot just study complexity. At some point, they need to act. And that requires them to basically take shortcuts such that they can actually still do something. And examples of these shortcuts include relying on trust networks to bring in experts, looking at the news to know what is the important problem to focus on, using existing agendas to use the right vocabulary to talk about policy issues, or they use past analogies on past events to think about future scenarios. So when often we talk about global catastrophic risks to diplomats, they would respond something like, oh, something like COVID. And we're like, no, not something like COVID, but we understand that this is your first direct analogy that you have when we talk about big risk. And I don't think we can change the fact that they use these shortcuts. I wish we could, but I think the reality is that we should actually work with the shortcuts and respond to them. So some examples that the Simon Institute uses to actually work with these shortcuts, one is to actually rely on this analogical thinking that diplomats and civil servants use. So we try to put them in simulated settings where diplomats face a global catastrophic risk. They have to face it, to respond to it. They probably fail, and then we can debrief with them on what this means for their future decision making. Other shortcuts that we employ is that we build relationships between researchers at CSER and others, and diplomats and civil servants, such that when windows of opportunity arise, these networks are in place and trust has been built, and these civil servants can actually rely on these networks to look for advice. At a higher level, what we also do is that we fit in the current agendas. So our common agenda is an exception. It is nicely focused on large risks and on future generations. And by working directly with the proposals of this agenda, that accelerates basically the fit we can find between GCRs and policy change. And at an even higher level of abstraction, what we try to do is to also create shortcuts for policy actors. What we hope to contribute to is the renewal of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030, which provides a narrative on how to conceive of society, how to conceive of risk of global issues. And if the agenda after 2030 has a better recognition of global catastrophic risks and future generations, that will serve many shortcuts to the global policy community that then we can use to actually make our points and create policy change. But the problem here is that using the shortcuts requires speed. It requires actors to be in the right place, at the right time, with the right information, with the right network, with the right credibility. We cannot just respond to a policymaker, oh, you need to know X, let me conduct a study about X and I will get back to you. If we say that, we will probably miss the opportunity because decision makers will move on without our input. So the question to the panel and to CSER and the audience basically is, are we actually ready to engage with these shortcuts? Are we doing the right research? Are we publishing it at the right time? Do we have enough tools in science communication to communicate it? And if not, how can we actually improve on all of these aspects given academic constraints? That's going to be.
Thanks very much, Max. Thank you. And an excellent question for all of us to answer. So finally, we have Xin Hua, who is a research affiliate at CSER. She's a lawyer with a focus on competition and technology, but also on public international law, and has also been looking at machine learning and lethal autonomous weapon systems. Xinxin's going to be speaking on regulation of artificial intelligence, governing the ungovernable. Xinxin.
So I'm going to talk about how we can use regulation to try and mitigate long-term AI risk, focusing on regulation of private companies. So let's just take a step back and think about the universe of norms that may be regulating private sector companies, so AI companies. So on the one hand, you may be thinking about sort of the top-down, your classic regulation, and then shading into sort of more industry-led self-regulation or industry standards, and then further onwards in the spectrum, things like shareholder pressure, investor pressure, something that we're seeing really, really substantially now in sustainability, or even in the recent events in Ukraine, pushing companies to act in certain ways, and then, you know, generally corporate culture and public opinion. So in that sort of spectrum of norms, what is the place of regulation of private companies here? Essentially, all of these pressures are important, but sometimes you do need regulation to basically force companies to do things, even if they don't really want to. And that's really the role of that. But regulation does work hand in hand with all the other different types of norms that I've talked about. And I'll sort of go on to how I think sort of all of them can work together to achieve the kind of objectives that we want. So firstly, why are we talking about regulating private companies rather than governments? Well, ideally, we'd like to regulate both, but in a sort of long-termist perspective, if we think about who are the most likely developers of advanced AI, based on the picture today, it seems most likely that that's going to be private sector-led. So we want to be making sure that the right standards and safety culture is ingrained in those companies as early on as possible. I get a bit of a so what question as well often when I talk about regulating in a long-termist perspective, which is, you know, when we get to that sort of advanced AI trajectory where we're nearing transformative AI development, is it not the likely outcome that these private companies simply become subsumed by governments because it becomes such a national security importance, these technologies, that a government will just simply nationalize the private company? Well, the answer to that is regulation still has a really key role to play. All the way up to that particular point in the trajectory, we have a lot of scope still to embed the right principles and safety governance and raise public expectations of certain AI safety standards. So I think regulation has a really, really critical role to play in that long-termist perspective. That's not to say that regulation has all the answers by any stretch. It faces a lot of challenges in regulating AI risk, both today and also in the long-termist perspective. And that's why I have this slightly sort of cynical question in my title, Governing the Ungovernable. And the kind of risks you'll probably be quite familiar with. So how do you regulate a fast-moving and complex technology? Especially in a scenario where we see resource and knowledge asymmetry between the public sector and the private sector. You know, these sky-high salaries that the private sector can offer the top computer scientists. You can have really shiny AI regulation, but if you don't have people who actually understand the industry and the products that are coming out to actually enforce the rules, detect the breaches, that's pointless. In a sort of advanced AI scenario, potentially the private sector will have that edge over the technology. Can they actually use that technology to evade detection and enforcement where the public sector is sort of lagging in that? So I call it sort of an inequality of arms problem. Regulatory capture is another concern. Again, something that is already a risk today, but in a scenario where very powerful companies are gaining a lot of wealth and influence, that risk just will potentially escalate. So after that, all that doom and gloom, there is some scope for skepticism, for hope, and some solutions really that we can already borrow from legal regimes today, in particular competition law. So competition law has long faced a lot of these challenges and has, I think, can offer some useful lessons when we think about how we want to govern AI risk going forward. So in particular, what do I mean when I talk about competition law? In one sentence, it is a legal regime that protects the process of rivalry between companies to enhance consumer welfare. There are certain approaches that it takes that I think are really useful potentially to this audience, and one is that a participative approach. So this is focusing on sort of the EU and UK competition regimes, but really we see these principles shared across many jurisdictions worldwide. And that is that in its decision-making process, competition regulators really have, at every stage of the way, public consultations, extensive engagement with industry and with civil society. When I say industry, it's both the competitors of the defendant company and also the customers, as well as academia. And there's a lot of transparency. So they publish, for example, provisional findings of what the direction they think they're going in, and they'll invite feedback and will genuinely consider the feedback from industry and other stakeholders. And I think that's a really, really useful approach that we can also borrow, echoing all the talk that I've heard, through the last few days about collaboration, about engaging a diversity of opinions. I think that this is also sort of a key way to implement that. Now, in terms of competition law as an important tool in achieving long-termist aims, sort of more directly or substantively, as well as that our participative approach, there are also some sort of substantive things that we can keep in mind. So certain synergies that we can try and leverage, but also tensions that we can try and resolve. So in particular, a lot of us in the community thinking about forms of cooperation between AI companies that can be beneficial from a long-termist perspective. So things like mutual monitoring or setting safety standards or transparency standards. Now, that's really great, but it can bring you in tension with competition law because it doesn't like competitors coordinating together. So I invite you, if you're interested in this topic, to check out an article that I wrote with Hayden Balefield in the Yale Journal of Law and Technology, where we look at these forms of cooperation and suggest some ways that we can implement some safeguards to ensure that we can make sure these forms of cooperation are sustainable in the longer term. Then think about sort of what I said about what competition law is. So it brings about a certain competitive outcome. So if you are of the camp where you're interested in or worried about harmful race dynamics and that sort of rivalry, a very intense race towards TAI, for example, then competition law might be a tension because competition law seeks to increase competition. And in particular, the assist clause is one proposal that the community has proposed. So it's an agreement between competitors not to compete with each other where they reach a certain stage of the development trajectory. That brings it on to quite problematic tension with competition law. So thinking through how we can try and resolve that is something that is sort of a really important area of attention. However, if you're worried about, on the other hand, concentration, so you're actually not so worried about too much competition, you're worried about too little competition. So that sort of winner-takes-all, monopoly-inducing effect as we develop more advanced AI, that concentration of wealth and power. Competition law can be a really useful tool to help you address that concentration. In its essence, it addresses market dominance and concentration and has various tools to try and address that. So it's an important synergy there if that is the outcome that you opt for. So just to wrap up, the key takeaways, I think this approach of a pluralistic, holistic and collaborative approach to regulation that we can sort of learn from competition law as a blueprint is really important. Sort of working hand in hand with industry and academia to address that resource asymmetry, that knowledge gap through open channels of communication and transparency is a really useful tool that we should sort of keep in mind as we think about governance of AI more broadly.
Thank you, Xin. I'm hoping somebody can do microphone. Yep. So we're going to go first to Anders, who wrote quite a an interesting long statement for Jenty. I wonder if you can translate it into a question. But it's around the horizon and the length of time and urgency that people have and how that translates, and us.
Risk from maybe 10% per year. Totally impossible to hear. Okay, let's do if I can summarize that thing, because now the panel knows what I'm saying. Yes, basically, how do we get people to have a somewhat accurate assessment about how gloomy they should be about the future? Because if they get an inaccurately high estimate of a gloom, then they don't want to fix the risk because there is actually little gain from it.
Was that to me?
To you, yes.
Oh, that's an easy one. No, I think that actually I would preface your question of you're not going to get an accurate assessment. And I say that with huge respect to my IPCC colleagues. And it's the wrong question. And that's why I say I think it's important to look at what you value. And what is very clear right now is that there are values for things like people and planet that are very immediate impacts, air pollution, the ability to maintain a natural environment, that are strong concerns that are not valued at all in your scientific equation. And so if we can reconfigure a scientific equation which instead of looking for your accurate number of is it 11 years or 9 years, and that's going to be the determinant of whether or not we should act, and frankly, that's been a very effective diversionary technique for the last 50 years in not getting us very far. Maybe that's not trying to precise to that level is not the right question. The question is, it's very clear that we are exceeding ecosystem limits already now. It's very clear that we can take action to rebalance things, but to do that, we need to adjust our system. So I would prefer to put less emphasis on the exactness of our end number and put more on the value of people, planet, prosperity.
Thank you, Jenty.
That's a personal view.
Of course. We've got a couple of others directed towards you from online. One is, what is your evidence that countries that have less inequality are better capable of coping with disasters, catastrophic ones? And the second being, is UNDRR the best coordinator, or the one being at the end of the bat phone when there is a disaster? So the first was from David Wood, the second from Ray Taylor.
Okay, maybe I can take the second one first. I think I try to explain to people that we don't do anything in our office. Actually, all we try and do is accelerate other people to do things better. And so we try to accelerate other people's good work on different aspects of risk reduction, somehow as it falls under this broad umbrella of the SENDAI Framework. So in that, I love my job in that we can try and be a connector and an accelerator, but I by no means would pretend that we're able to solve different parts of this. And I think we need lots of different parts, private, public, academic, entities engaging in reducing risk. And that range of people would need to be at the end of your bat phone. In terms of the proof, I think that it's pretty, look at global health outcomes. Tell me a disaster where you can't see that you can pull out inequality. And I would say that's basically your answer. COVID is a beautiful one. Disasters are a beautiful one. I can pull many, many, many studies where, if you are poor, if you are of some sort of a minority group, if you are socially excluded before a shock hits, you are virtually guaranteed to be worst affected when that shock hits. If the person who posed the question could show me an example where that's not the case, I would love to know it. I'm sure there is probably something like, full-out nuclear annihilation. Maybe that might be the one I would pull. But otherwise, I think it's a fairly good rule of thumb.
Great, thank you. We've got a question at the back there.
Yeah, so many thanks for your really very well-structured and very enlightening talk. I learned a lot from it. And I agree to almost everything, but there's one point I don't agree, or I'm in doubt at least. And you were mentioning the point of strengthening resilience and being prepared, strengthening the capacity to recover, to restructure, to rebuild. And I'm very aware that this is the actual way of how to prepare for catastrophes and so on. Being an historian, I'm not quite sure about that approach, because we can say anything from history is that the world is constantly changing. And so I'm concerned with the recover, restructure, or rebuild and so on, and resilience. I agree that this is the easiest way to sell the program to politicians and to societies facing a risk, that we promise them that they will return to what we call the old normal, or that they can keep a lot of the old normal. But what might be more successful in the long run is not resilience, but adaptation. It's not recovery, but discovery, not in the sense of progress, but to be open for what's opening up new, what's coming up new, and how to adapt to a new situation, which might be much more successful than all these terms with which imagine a going back or a getting back what was lost. So that's more a question or a doubt about the meta program in what you presented.
I think I probably didn't present the point well enough then, because what I was trying to get back, there's an awful phrase, it's overused, build back better. I think it is on a slide somewhere, and that's trying to move in that direction. And I would very much agree with you there. And I think actually what I'm trying to say is there is no going back. We have a very uncertain future. So it's not about building things back to where they were. It's about creating more. And I don't think the in resilience is the same as the in regeneration, perhaps. Maybe it's a linguistic point. I essentially agree with you. And I think there are, for example, in the climate change space, there is this huge black box around beyond adaptation, because I don't even think adaptation is enough yet. I think there are serious issues that we need to place about how we are going to deal with trends that are now unpreventable in everything from, I lived in Vietnam for the best part of 7 years, and you only have to go to many of the coastal resorts to realize that, there are huge investments that were made that are very rapidly becoming unviable now as a result of storm surge and sea level rise. This is not a theoretical problem, and I would very much agree we can't go back to some past.
Else want to answer that one? Okay.
Can I add to that? I tend to agree that adaptation to me is sort of part of building resilience, and the key is the agility point, I think, that Jenty made earlier, and making sure that the system is agile. And what I see at the moment in government is a lot of lumbering governance, not overarching, too many silos, static risk registers. nothing that's particularly agile and capable of dealing with the sort of systemic risk that we're looking at. And I think, as I said, the private sector has quite a lot to bring to that party in terms of having the agility to respond and to adapt in the way that you're talking about.
Yes, being married to the chief executive of a government agency who is responsible for risk registers, I would utterly agree with that statement. Yes, you.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and we could think a lot about like what are the right concepts, analytical approaches, institutional design mechanisms to actually respond and adapt well. But I think in the face of global catastrophic risk, we also need to talk about like how to act before things happen, which is prevention. And we have evidence on how governments, international organizations, the EU, and even autocratic regimes change their policy priorities over time. And across all of these contexts, the change of priorities is reactive to events that happen in the world, which for events like COVID might be just fine. We can react. There is some time, we are harmed, but we can actually mitigate and hopefully recover and build back better. In the case of global catastrophic risks, that challenges our reactive capacity so much that, in fact, the approaches we have in adaptation and recovery are useful, yes, but it's a different type of governance than the one that we have for prevention. And if we need prevention, we're basically challenging the decades of evidence we have showing that governments are reactive. And that basically requires more profound changes in like the narratives we have in policy, I believe, in how we plan policy priorities over time, and then what kind of like accelerators we can have across governments to make sure that like we can actually anticipate threats before they actually manifest, which in my opinion is like a very different question than talking about like reaction and mitigation, and that tends to be kind of like overlooked as well.
Great, thank you. Xin.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question from the legal perspective as well. And just focusing on competition law now, there's been a lot of criticism, in particular in relation to digital competition, those really fast-moving markets, that competition law acts too slowly and sort of many years after the event. How do we actually get in there preemptively before the risk occurs? And actually, there's now proposals for a completely new regulatory regime for these tech companies, exactly looking at this sort of what they call ex-ante approach. How do you step in before the harm occurs to keep hold of these dynamic markets? So let's see if they achieve their aim, but it's certainly something that's a very live discussion also in the legal sphere.
You've all answered another set of questions online, so that's really great. Xin, while you have the microphone, I have one specifically for you, which is what are the best examples so far of AI being regulated?
Good question. I think it's important to look at not just sort of AI-specific regulations. So the classic type of regulation would be, for example, the new EU AI Act that's still coming into force, but to recognize sort of there's a patchwork of existing regulatory regimes that would go towards regulating AI risks. So competition law is one of them, as I've explained, but there's also data privacy and protection that has also got provisions in there that look at various AI risks. There's also tort liability, product liability, as well as things like the FDI regulation that also focuses on AI. So I think rather than giving you a specific example, there's quite a lot. It's, I think, to really encourage you to think of an approach where you're not just looking at AI-specific regulation, but what are the existing webs of regulation that we can use to govern AI risk?
We've got a question at the back there, Marion.
Thanks for really interesting presentations. So I try to think of a question that you all could answer, and hopefully this is something that you all find interesting to think about. Because what you all spoke about in some way or another was the need for systemic change and the need for breaking down silos. And that's something that I also really struggle with in my day-to-day work. And while it sounds very appealing in a presentation. It's actually very difficult to do in practice. So I was wondering, for all of you, what do you think the easiest thing is that we can do, the easiest next step in order to break down silos and encourage systemic transformation? And what's the most urgent one? And is there a difference? And if so, how can we move from one to the other? Thank you.
That's a great question. Marion always had really good questions for me when I was working at BASIC, and they were always incredibly difficult to answer. We'll go this way.
Okay, I'll try that first. I think it's a great question, and it's one I've thought a bit about, because in business, in the private sector, you tend to go straight to governance, because governance is the thing that tends to unlock the whole piece for you. If you get the governance right, then risk management has a chance of working properly as it should. And you put a risk management framework across a company and you do it effectively, then the other pieces tend to fall into place, and the silos then break down because you have the overarching structure. I have a feeling, I'm not sure about this, maybe I'll be able to talk more next year if I'm invited back on whether this works in government, but I think maybe government works the other way around. So maybe we need to talk about methodology with government first, and process, and workshops, and co-create some solution to this, looking at more effective risk management frameworks, challenging them on static risk registers and looking at how those can be approved, time horizons, all those different subjects, and particularly vulnerability assessment. I think if we can get away from the argument about likelihood and talk about vulnerability and really look at assessing that and do that in a way that's sort of co-creative with government, then maybe that's the better way in. So starting with the methodology and the process I've talked about first, and then moving up to governance, which I think is in a government setting more challenging and more difficult. Thanks.
Yeah, excellent question. And I think if I think of competition law as a case study again, I think there's various silos that it has sought to break down with quite some success. So you can think of geographic silos. So competition regulators, obviously, domestic, or you have the European Commission. But there's actually a very active network of regulatory agencies. So it's called the International Competition Network of about 130 members, and they act really well to sort of ensure sharing of learning and information, and sort of I think that is a really great type of blueprint to encourage breaking down of geographic silos. There's a silo between private and public, and I think as I talked about, this participative approach to regulation, I think is super important to ensure that we can kind of get the best out of the private sector, but then also use sort of the strength and sanctions of the public sector as well, or public enforcement as well. And then in terms of regulatory regimes, that's another type of silo. So as I just mentioned, it's important to think about regulation of AI risk, not just focused on sort of AI regulation, but all the network of different types of regulatory regimes that are relevant to it, and think about how all the different those enforcement regimes can coordinate together to make sure that gets to the right outcome. Yeah.
I'll answer from like a multilateral UN perspective. I think one way to avoid silos is to actually not replicate them. So I think often in X-risk global governance discussions, people mention the idea of the need to create kind of like an intergovernmental panel for X-risk reduction. The same for then we have our IPCC, but for X-risk. And I think like there are many ways that like this actually replicates silos, because we task one entity to focus on many X-risk, which in my opinion remove the responsibility on X-risk from the existing bodies that have decades of existence. So I think one way to move forward is, instead of setting up new entities to focus on one thing we care about, because that's like an easy concrete proposal, we need to think about how existential risks, GCRs, actually integrate within the current systems and administrations in place.
Yeah, I think picking up on that point, maybe just most simply put, in terms of what I found most successful, or at least least failure prone, is you've got to plug yourself into other people's systems. And so, for example, in these, the common country assessments, I didn't make those 13 risk categorizations. I don't necessarily love all of them, but I realized that if we needed to get better understanding of systemic risk into it, we've designed a program that works with that and is built into what was already in place. Because those people are busy, they have their own worlds. And so I think if you want to break down silos, you've got to do exactly as Paul suggested this morning, which is actually really try and listen to what some of those other silos are interested in and make a compelling argument and find some way of showing why what is relevant is useful to them. And that, I think, resonates much more. In terms of the most pressing, I think that James's points are very, very clear. And what I see right now is that we've got to break down that public-private sector division in understanding risk. And we've got to find some way of getting the banks, the private sector companies, and the public sector able to have some sort of common language around some of these issues. Because I really do feel that we have some really serious mispricings and misunderstandings of some of the metrics around global risks that we're facing. And that in itself almost creates a risk, a different type of risk in the system.
Thank you. I've got a question from Sam Clark. And Tom, who's been doing the typing, says, Caesar for now. Maybe he knows something I don't. But anyway, Sam, microphone, thank
you. This one's probably for Jinjin, but maybe for anyone else who has takes on it. So like, there are like lots of levers you might use for like governing transformative AI, and you mentioned like several of them as you were talking. I'm curious if you have any takes on just like ones that seem particularly overrated or underrated by like in discussions that you hear. Takes very welcome.
Underrated levers. I think FDI regulation, so foreign direct investment regulation, is something that is going to be of growing importance, and I haven't had that much debate about it recently or in this community. And so focusing on the UK, it's basically certain rules. If there's any kind of acquisition or investment of a UK company that is in a sensitive sector, and AI is very much part of that, the government will scrutinise that. And I think that's going to make it much harder for a lot of consolidation to happen in the AI space. And I think that's going to be really important in thinking about what's the kind of competitive landscape going to be for AI companies going forward, where consolidation becomes much harder, and thinking through that. So I think that's a really important lever that, yeah, I like to see more investigation in.
Thank you. We have a question from Clarissa.
Yes. What can CSIR researchers do to support your work? But like specifically, shall we go and have some weeks working with you at your offices, or would you be keen to come and spend some time with us as an intensive visitor program that we have? Do we need to create more spaces like this? Or do you envision other type of opportunities where we concretely can support the work that you do? And then the second question will be in relation to the UN. Every time that I have interacted with UN offices, I can feel that there is this gap where the UN cannot enforce policies on state parties. So if it's a political problem that we have, like with climate change, civil society is on it, scientists are on it, why things don't happen faster, right? If it's a political problem, like what can we do to change that and not keep doing the same things as always?
That's for you, Jenty, I think.
Oh, I mean, I think the question of how we can interact more, I think is one hopefully we can come into a little bit more detail in this afternoon or understand more. But I definitely think there are a lot of opportunities to connect. And I think that whole question of the science policy interface, we need to get better at it. And so let's find ways of doing that. And I think your presentation was a fantastic inroads to that. In terms of where that takes us, in terms of the, I think this whole issue of enforceability in the, I realized when I started off working in the NGO sector, and then when I moved to the UN, I was constantly being bombarded by at parties of people. It's like being a doctor, where people are like, you're failing in this, and you're failing in that, and you can't do this. And it took me a little while to realize that by the time a problem comes to a UN body, it's because it's not easy to solve, that it's essentially got a wicked element to it, which is why it's been kicked out from the domestic realm into the global realm, because it's been a little bit unsolvable. And so if you look at it in that filter, of course it's, you know, the idea of enforceability to a wicked problem is not something you would necessarily think of as reasonable. But what is also true is that the politicians and the people who are sent to those intergovernmental processes, whether they're from NGOs, whether they're from governments, they're human beings. And many of those conversations that happen in terms of understanding and discussion and dialogue, as much in the hallways often as in the actual meeting rooms, are processes in themselves for sharing and learning. And we live in a world where that's much speeded up. We've got incredible opportunities through, you know, Zoom and Teams and different ways of interacting. So I think we should focus on that rather than this idea that somehow or other countries are going to give up their sovereignty to some over element. I mean, you only have to look at Brexit to realize that's not a realistic expectation. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that, for example, the IPCC hasn't been extraordinarily effective in creating the base beat of scientific understanding across the entire globe on an issue like climate change. Does that answer your question at all?
I used to say when teaching systems that part of the problem of complexity is there are so many opinions about what needs to happen. Adding your own opinion just makes more complexity. The issue around control is often the problem. So just increasing control just increases the problem when you're dealing with complexity. So often government officials find it the most difficult to deal with this sort of thing, particularly politicians, because they are all about control by identity. But actually we need to transform the way we do governance away from control and more into collaboration. Did you want to say something, Max? I heard you.
Very briefly. So we already work with CSER researchers, so I'm not going to expand on this. I think in most cases it will be a political problem. In most cases we need different parties that have different worldviews and priorities to actually agree such that something happens. And on the way they agree is not proportional to the information we give to them. It's not with evidence that you actually convince many parties to actually agree. So we need to find like common denominators, consensual ways to talk about GCRs for member states, civil society, UN agencies to actually work together. And that's a question that goes way beyond having good research. And I think to actually make progress on this is to reframe the field of global catastrophic risks, not just as a research field, but also as a field of practice and policy making, because we basically need like additional professions than the ones we currently have in research institutions. We need knowledge brokers, we need science communicators, we need also diplomats, we need policymakers within administrations, and like that can form a field of global catastrophic risk reduction, which we're currently kind of building pretty slowly. But I believe we need these professions in addition to the current ones if we want to like solve these political problems, which requires more than information.
Thank you. Yes, Max, apologies, that was my mobile phone encouraging you to get up and dance. Gordon, you've waited long, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good for me to practice patience. I wanted to raise the game a bit because away from the previous sort of discussion about return to base and adaptation, and try and ask a question about the concept of transformation, which Paul just mentioned. You want to transform the system, because often when you're looking at risks, it's about system change and redesign, not just about step-by-step change. And I mean, the best example I like to give is that after World War III, we're going to have to design a new system for how we run the world thereafter. Alternatively, why can't we design the system now for how we'd like to run the world and avoid World War III? Because it's usually collapse and breakdown that actually generates the breakthrough to another level of design. But more importantly, it's about the mind that designs transformation is a different way of thinking from the design that is there incremental improvements? And I think that concept of system change and redesign is often overlooked. So how can I make a question out of that? Can I hear, I'd like to hear from all of you really on your experiences in this territory and how successful they might have been.
Seems like a good final question for each of you to give your final thoughts as well for the panel. So I'll start with you.
Yeah, great question, Gordon. I think, again, I sort of hark back to the private sector and sort of build on experiences there. But I think there have been many traumas and collapses and challenges for parts of the private sector over the past 30, 40 years, particularly with financial services. So the guys who are leading edge in terms of risk management in the private sector are definitely in financial services. And best practice risk management has come out of financial services into other areas of the private sector, I think. So I think you're right in terms of the fact that you can, from collapse and calamity, you can then learn a lot about, and they've had to learn a lot about redesign and designing risk management practice almost from scratch. And the 3 lines of defense came out of that, the trauma of the financial crisis back at the end of the 90s, and then refined again in the financial crisis of the early 2000s or 2008-9. And I think we've got a lot to learn from them now, because that really is best practice, I think, in terms of how risk management might translate to government. So I think in short answer to your question, I think it's the design that's come from experience of collapse in the private sector that we can learn from.
So I think regulators do struggle with thinking about systems. They always look at sort of what's the foreseeable direct impact. So competition law, again, they like to think about sort of only 2 or 3 years in the future. If you're talking about harms, it's can you evidence that, quantify that, and give me economic evidence they require of, price impact, for example. And I think one thing that would be very beneficial is for us to try and encourage a broader view of harm, systemic types of harm, beyond that sort of direct impact. We're starting to see quite good progress in sort of discussions around sustainability. So regulators are starting to recognize that more complex, remote, difficult to quantify type of risk. And so I think that can offer some quite useful avenues, but still a way to go. But there are some glimmers of hope in that regard.
So I think in addition to what you said, one way to actually reach transformation is to get many large systems from governments to populations across the world to actually look in the same direction. And for that, narratives are actually quite useful. So you mentioned sustainability. The sustainable development narrative has trickled down to governments, to private sector, to civil society. And now, almost everybody knows about the SDGs. Not necessarily everybody acts about them, but the SDGs is actually something in many minds. And one way to, I think, redirect that attention and have this common vocabulary is to think a bit about, okay, if we take sustainability, how can we have a sustainability 2.0 that on the one hand recognizes existential threats, but at the same time still cultivates a lot of hope, because we don't want to kind of build disillusion in so many systems. And I think one way to kind of also improve that is to actually replace technology in the picture. In the sustainability narrative, technologies are, for the most part, actually left out. And often, people following sustainability end up with a pretty techno-pessimistic narrative. And ideally, what we build in terms of narrative is something that is optimistic about the future and that leverage technology for the goods and diminish the downsides of risky technologies, which is some building blocks to actually build a common vocabulary to think about the world.
I think that somebody already said that change is the only constant, and our systems are transforming. And if we are still around, and I'm lucky enough to have grandchildren, I am utterly convinced that they will be amazed that I once drove up to a petrol station and put pure hydrocarbon into a vehicle just to drive to the supermarket. That will be an utter anathema. So that the idea that you wait to design a system to transform it isn't necessarily valid. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but I think that what I'm interested in is buffering. We are in a transformation, and you know, climate change is a beautiful example of we are going through the biggest transformation that will be a make or break, and we can try to buffer that, and we can try to reduce the degree of shock in that. And if we do that well, if we can figure out what begins to work and we can use our learning loops, I think someone else talked about that this morning, if we can accelerate the learning for how we've been able to buffer and stop some of those shocks escalating, then we have a very good beginning of a blueprint for where transformation can genuinely work. And so I almost feel like you're sort of throwing something up at the wall, and you've got to see if it sticks. Okay, why did that stick? What went well? And learn from it, because I think that may be the most effective way in promoting actual transformation, and that won't be a 3-page white paper that is somehow disseminated. It doesn't mean that a 3-page white paper can't be one of the things that sticks, that grabs people's attention. But you know, I think we just need to recognize that it's a very fast-moving situation, and the transformation is already happening.